Imagine a royal party where a velvet mask allows the queen to sleep with a stranger, and the king crawls on the floor, his naked body coated in hot tar and glued hair to look like a beast. They called it a game of anonymous lust, but in this room heavy with sweat and secrets, a single drunken torch is about to turn their fantasy into a screaming, melting nightmare. Who is really hiding behind the mask? Suffocating heat of the grand hall, heavy with the cloying sense of musk and nervous perspiration, the stone vaults of the royal palace of St. Paul echo not with courtly music, but with a guttural, animalistic howling that is slowly being drowned out by the wet crackle of fire-consuming human flesh. 6 figures, bound together by a single heavy chain, thrash wildly in the center of the floor, resembling living torches that illuminate the terrified faces of the onlookers who press themselves against the tapestries, desperate to keep the flying sparks away from their flammable silks and velvets. Just moments ago, this space was a sanctuary of calculated lust and absolute permissiveness, but the masquerade has instantaneously transformed into a vision of hell. To truly comprehend how the French royal court descended into this flaming madness, one must unwind the fabric of time and look back to a period when the mask was not a death shroud, but a coveted passport into a world of forbidden indulgences. It is the late 14th century, and Europe is gasping under the weight of the Black Death, the 100 Years' War, and the Great Schism of the Church, yet in the heart of Paris, death feels like nothing more than a distant, inconvenient rumor. King Charles VI sits on the throne, but his mind is fracturing, prone to violent fits of insanity that leave the court in a state of perpetual anxiety and desperate need of distraction. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, tasked with the impossible burden of managing a mad husband and a restless nobility, transformed the royal household into a landscape of endless festivities, a glittering bubble that floated above the misery of the common people. It was here, amidst the golden goblets and imported fabrics, that the concept of the masquerade ball evolved from simple entertainment into a complex social mechanism. In a world bound by rigid hierarchies and suffocating religious etiquette, the masquerade offered the only true escape, allowing the highest lords to shed their responsibilities and the most pious ladies to forget their vows, if only until dawn broke. When a noble donned a mask at the Hotel St. Paul, they ceased to be a duke, a countess, or a queen, they became a phantom, a creature without a name, without a past, and most importantly, without accountability to God or man. This anonymity was the fuel for a new kind of chaos, where the strict boundaries of feudalism dissolved into a fluid dance of desire. A princess could flirt with a squire, and a bishop could dance with a courtesan, and in this swirling confusion of identities, a terrifying new freedom was born, governed not by the laws of the realm, but by the raw impulses of the flesh. Under the cover of night and behind the safety of velvet visors, the court engaged in carefully orchestrated debauchery that contemporaries whispered about as gallant games, though they were often little more than organized adultery. Men and women, their faces obscured by grotesque or beautiful disguises, slipped away into the shadowed alcoves and dimly lit galleries, seeking intimacy with partners whose names they might not know and would never ask. It was a game of high stakes, where the thrill of the unknown partner heightened the senses, turning the royal residence into a labyrinth of secrets where silence was the most valuable currency. Yet, beneath the laughter and the rustle of expensive fabrics, a dark specter haunted the minds of the dynasty, a fear far more insidious than the plague, the uncertainty of bloodlines. As the masquerades grew more frequent and the couplings more random, the question of legitimacy began to gnaw at the foundations of the monarchy. If a queen or a duchess shares her bed with a masked stranger during the chaos of the carnival, who can say with certainty that the child born 9 months later possesses the royal blood required to rule? The mask allowed bastards to be hidden in plain sight, woven into the tapestry of noble families, turning the succession into a game of genetic roulette. This atmosphere of suspicion and hedonism reached its fever pitch in the winter of 1393, during the wedding festivities of a lady-in-waiting, a widow whose remarriage provided the perfect excuse for a chivere, a rowdy and subversive celebration. The king, seeking to shake off the melancholy of his illness, conspired with 5 of his closest favorites to perform a dance that would shock and titillate the ladies of the court. They decided to appear as woodwasses, mythical wild men of the forest, representing the savage, untamed nature that the court pretended to suppress but secretly craved. The preparation for this performance was a disaster waiting to happen, born of ignorance and a desire for absolute realism in their savage guise. The king and his 5 companions were stripped down and sewn into tight-fitting linen suits, which were then heavily coated with resin and pitch to make the fabric sticky. On top of this highly flammable adhesive, they attached unraveled flax and tow to mimic the shaggy fur of beasts, transforming themselves into walking bundles of kindling. The costume designer, perhaps sensing the danger, strictly forbade the presence of torches in the hall, knowing that a single spark could turn the resin into an inferno. When the 6 wild men burst into the festivities on the night of the 28th of January, they were unrecognizable, their identities completely subsumed by the flax and pitch, presenting themselves as monsters from the edge of the world. They danced with manic energy, howling and gnashing their teeth, shaking the chains that bound them together to emphasize their captive savagery. The court was delighted, the ladies shrieking in a mixture of mock terror and genuine arousal, as the king and his companions moved through the crowd, soliciting touches and guesses about who hid beneath the savage exteriors. The anonymity was absolute. Even the young Duchess of Berry, who found herself grabbed by one of the dancers, could not tell that the man attempting to frighten her was her own uncle, the King of France. It was the ultimate success of the masquerade, the total erasure of social order, where the monarch could act the part of a beast and be treated as such. However, the delicate balance of this dangerous game was shattered by the arrival of the Duke of Orleans, the king's brother, who entered the hall late, accompanied by servants bearing torches, oblivious to the prohibition and fueled by wine. Driven by a fatal curiosity and the arrogance of his station, the Duke of Orleans approached the dancers, holding his torch dangerously close to the flaxen fur, desperate to penetrate the anonymity and discover the faces of the men who dared to mock the court's dignity. He leaned in, the flame licking the air mere inches from the pitch-soaked linen, and in that split second, the tension of the era, the madness, the secrets, the hidden sins, coalesced into a single point of heat. The flax caught fire instantly, not with a slow burn, but with a violent, explosive whoosh that engulfed the dancers before they could even scream, turning the masquerade into a blazing funeral pyre. To understand the sheer magnitude of the tragedy that would unfold within the fiery halls of the Hotel St. Pol, one must first survey the desolate landscape of the world that surrounded the gilded cage. The Europe of the late 14th century was a continent brought to its knees, a civilization gasping for breath under the weight of apocalyptic horsemen that seemed to ride without ceasing. The Great Plague, though it had swept through with its scythe decades earlier, had left a scar upon the collective psyche that refused to heal, returning in cyclical waves to harvest those who had dared to hope for survival. Villages lay abandoned, swallowed by reclaiming forests, and the stench of unburied death had become a familiar perfume to a generation that had known nothing but loss. Beyond the biological terror, the spiritual foundations of Christendom had cracked wide open, leaving the faithful adrift in a sea of doubt and heresy. The Great Schism had torn the Church asunder, with 2 popes, one in Rome and one in Avignon, hurling anathemas at one another, each claiming to hold the keys to heaven while effectively locking the gates of salvation for the common man. If the vicars of Christ could not agree on the will of God, then the moral compass of humanity was shattered, and in the cracks of this broken authority, a profound cynicism took root. It was a time when prayer felt futile and the heavens seemed made of brass, unresponsive to the wailing of the starving peasantry. Yet, in the very heart of this dying world, Paris stood as a defiant paradox, a city of dualities where the gutter and the galaxy collided. While the streets outside the royal residence were open sewers running with filth and the blood of butchers, the court of King Charles VI existed in a suspended reality, a hermetically sealed vessel of perfume and light. The king, known initially as the Beloved, had become the tragic anchor of this surreal existence. His mind, once bright and promising, had fractured under the strain of rule, giving way to a madness that was as unpredictable as it was terrifying. The catalyst for this descent had been a sun-drenched day in the forest of Le Mans, where the snap of a lance against a helmet sent the king into a frenzy, causing him to turn his sword against his own men. Since that bloody afternoon, Charles lived in the shadow of his own psyche, oscillating between lucid melancholy and violent outbursts where he did not recognize his own name or the face of his wife. There were months when he refused to bathe, believing himself to be made of fragile glass that would shatter at the slightest touch, a delusion that forced the court to walk on eggshells, literally and metaphorically, around their crystalline monarch. To manage this volatile reality, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, a woman of sharp intellect and insatiable appetite for life, took it upon herself to construct a world that could contain the king's demons. She understood that silence was the enemy of the mad, that reflection bred despair, and so she filled the void with noise, color, and perpetual motion. Under her guidance, the Hotel St. Pol was transformed into a carnival that never slept, a fortress of pleasure designed to distract the king from the abyss widening in his mind. The queen, often unfairly maligned by history as merely vacuous, was in truth a desperate jailer, using silk and wine as the bars of her husband's comfortable prison. The fashion of the court reflected this desperate need for escapism, becoming increasingly exaggerated and surreal, as if the nobles were trying to outrun reality through sheer aesthetic volume. Women shaved their hairlines to extend their foreheads, crowning themselves with towering hennons, horned headdresses that draped veils like waterfalls, forcing them to duck through doorways. Men wore shoes with toes so long they had to be chained to their knees, rendering walking a delicate art form. It was a visual language of excess, a scream of vanity in the face of the encroaching dark, where the cost of a single robe could feed a village for a year. It was within this hothouse of repressed terror and forced gaiety that the culture of the masquerade took root and flourished like a poisonous orchid. The mask was not merely a costume accessory. In the deeply hierarchical society of the Middle Ages, it was a radical, almost blasphemous tool of social subversion. In the light of day, every man and woman had a fixed place in the great chain of being, ordained by God and enforced by rigid etiquette. A duke did not jest with a squire, a queen did not embrace a page. But the mask dissolved these divinely appointed boundaries, creating a temporary void where the laws of man no longer applied. When a courtier slid a visor of velvet or papier-mâché over their face, they were committing a theological transgression, effectively erasing the image of God in which they were created. The church railed against these devil's faces, warning that those who hid their true selves were inviting Satan to take possession of the hollow shell. Yet, the thrill of the transgression only sweetened the appeal. For the nobility, trapped in dynastic marriages devoid of passion and burdened by the crushing weight of their titles, the anonymity of the mask offered a narcotic release, a chance to step out of history and into a realm of pure sensation. The atmosphere at these balls was thick with a tension that was distinct from ordinary revelry. It was the electric charge of predator and prey circling in the dark. The grand halls were lit by thousands of beeswax candles, casting long, dancing shadows that made the grotesque masks seem to leer and whisper. The air grew heavy with the heat of hundreds of bodies, the scent of roasting meats mingling with the heavy animal musk of perfumes imported from the east. In this sensory overload, the mask allowed for a suspension of consequences. A hand lingering on a waist, a whisper in an ear, a clandestine meeting in a shadowed alcove, these were no longer acts of treason or adultery, but part of the great game. This chaos of incognito created a terrifying new kind of freedom, where the only governing law was the immediacy of desire. The court of love, as Isabeau termed her circle, became a laboratory for moral experimentation. Without a name, a man was not a father, a husband, or a vassal, he was simply a force of will. Without a face, a woman was not a chaste wife or a bargaining chip in a treaty, she was a vessel of pleasure. The mask allowed the ID to conquer the superego, turning the royal palace into a swirling vortex where the basest instincts were dressed in the finest brocades. However, this liberation came with a corrosive price that ate away at the very legitimacy of the Valois dynasty. The medieval world was obsessed with lineage, blood was the currency of power, and the purity of that blood was the bedrock of the state. But in a court where queens and duchesses danced with unknown partners, where the night was a blur of interchangeable bodies, the certainty of paternity evaporated. Whispers began to circulate in the taverns of Paris, poisonous rumors that the royal children were not the fruit of the king's loins, but the byproducts of these anonymous unions. The mask, intended to hide the wearer, ended up exposing the fragility of the entire succession. The figure who came to embody this dangerous allure was the king's younger brother, Louis, the Duke of Orleans. Charming, arrogant, and relentlessly ambitious, Louis moved through the masquerades like a shark in dark water, using the confusion to sow discord and pursue his conquests. His closeness to the queen, amplified by the king's frequent incapacitation, fueled the most scandalous gossip of the age. When they danced together, masked and untouchable, the court watched with bated breath, seeing not just a romance, but a political shifting of tectonic plates. The mask allowed them to act out a power dynamic that would have been treasonous in the light of day. It was not just the sexual morality that was inverted by the masquerade, the very concept of sanity was turned on its head. The king, whose grip on reality was slipping, found a strange comfort in the disguise. When he wore a mask, his internal chaos matched the external world. He was no longer the broken monarch failing his people, he was just another grotesque face in the crowd. The balls of the savages, or bals d'ardents, were the culmination of this desire to regress. They were not polite dances, but primal rituals where the most civilized men in Europe strove to become beasts, rejecting the burden of their humanity. The specific event that would lead to the catastrophe was born from this obsession with the primitive. The occasion was the wedding of a lady-in-waiting to the queen, a woman named Catherine de Fastavarina. Because Catherine was a widow marrying for the second time, the event was deemed a suitable occasion for a chivalry, a raucous, mocking celebration traditionally reserved for remarriages, which were seen as slightly scandalous. The court seized upon this excuse to stage a spectacle that would push the boundaries of decency further than ever before. It was not enough to simply dance, they wanted to shock, to terrify, to evoke the raw power of the untamed wilderness. The idea was proposed by Hugues de Gissé, a favorite of the king known for his cruel wit and darker proclivities. He suggested that the king and 5 of his companions dress as woodwasses, the mythical wild men of the forest who symbolized nature's savage, unbridled force. These creatures were the antithesis of the courtier, they were violent, lustful, and free from the chains of civilization. To play the woodwose was to toy with the taboo of being non-human, to descend the ladder of creation and wallow in the mud of instinct. It was the ultimate mask, not just hiding the face, but erasing the species. Preparation for this fatal masquerade involved a level of craftsmanship that bordered on the grotesque. To achieve the look of hairy beasts, the linen costumes were not merely sewn, they were sculpted directly onto the bodies of the men. A thick layer of pitch, a sticky, tar-like substance used for waterproofing ships, was smeared over the fabric. Upon this adhesive base, pounds of unraveled flax and tow were pressed, creating a shaggy, realistic fur that bristled with every movement. The men were effectively sealed inside highly combustible cocoons, their sweat trapped against their skin, their vision limited by the rough eyeholes of their bestial masks. As the night of the ball approached, the atmosphere in the Hotel St. Paul was brittle with anticipation. The king, in a moment of rare lucidity mixed with boyish excitement, seemed to look forward to the prank. For a man who often believed he was made of glass, the chance to become a rugged, indestructible monster of the forest must have felt like a salvation. He would not be the fragile Charles, he would be the wild man, a creature of strength and terror. The irony was tragic, in seeking to escape his fragility by donning the skin of a beast, he was wrapping himself in a death shroud woven from the most flammable materials known to men. The courtiers, unaware of the specific nature of the surprise, prepared themselves for another night of decadent oblivion. They donned their own masks, drinking deep from the cups of spiced wine, preparing to lose themselves in the anonymity of the crowd. Outside, the winter wind howled through the narrow streets of Paris, carrying the groans of the sick and the destitute, but inside, the fires were stoked high, and the musicians tuned their instruments. The stage was set not just for a dance, but for a collision between the fantasy of the court and the brutal reality of physics. The mask, which had served so long to hide the sins of the Valois, was about to become the instrument of their judgment. As the great bells of Notre Dame tolled the hour of Compline, signaling the end of the pious day, the Hotel St. Paul underwent a metamorphosis that was as terrifying as it was seductive. The expansive residence, a sprawling complex of apartments and gardens near the Seine, ceased to be the seat of administrative government and transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and silk. Servants extinguished the main torches in the corridors, leaving only the flickering light of distant hearths and the glow of strategically placed candelabras to guide the way. This lowering of the lights was not merely for economy, it was a deliberate theatrical choice, setting the stage for a performance where visibility was the enemy and obscurity was the ultimate luxury. In the grand ballroom, the air grew thick and intoxicating, a palpable miasma of expensive perfumes masking the underlying stench of the medieval city. The music shifted from the rigid, mathematical polyphony of the church to the rhythmic, driving beats of the danse macabre and the carol. It was a primal pulse that seemed to bypass the intellect and speak directly to the blood. Under the cover of this auditory assault and the protective velvet of their disguises, the court plunged into a carefully choreographed chaos. This was the realm of the gallant games, a polite euphemism that barely concealed the reality of systemic, sanctioned adultery practiced by the most powerful people in Christendom. The architecture of the palace itself seemed to conspire in this debauchery. The Hotel St. Paul was not a single fortress but a collection of connected dwellings, full of twisting corridors, hidden staircases, and alcoves draped in heavy tapestries. These shadowed recesses became temporary confessionals of the flesh, where men and women, their identities obliterated by masks of leather, feathers, and gems, engaged in acts that would have warranted excommunication in the light of day. Here, a hand could reach out from the darkness to pull a passerby into a secluded embrace, and the silence of the partner was guaranteed by the mutual guilt of the masquerade. It was a social mechanism born of desperate necessity, a pressure valve for a class of people trapped in the iron cage of dynastic duty. Marriage in the 14th century, particularly for the high nobility, was a cold calculation of land, dowries, and treaties. Love was an alien concept, an irrelevance that was not expected to bloom within the marital bed. A 12-year-old princess might be wed to a 60-year-old duke to secure a border, or a vibrant young count forced to marry a sickly heiress to pay off debts. These unions were dry, passionless contracts, leaving a void of emotional and physical starvation that the masquerade rushed to fill. The mask provided the solution to this emotional famine. By erasing the face, the mask erased the contract. In the anonymous swirl of the ballroom, a woman was no longer the property of her husband, and a man was no longer the custodian of his family name. They were reduced to bodies, to heat and breath and desire. This anonymity allowed for free connections that bypassed the rigid social stratification of the era. A squire with a well-turned leg and a mysterious demeanor could seduce a duchess, provided he never removed his visor. The thrill lay in the transgression, in the vertiginous possibility that one was sleeping with an enemy, a subordinate, or a stranger who would be gone by dawn. However, this liberation came at a terrifying genealogical cost. The sexual freedom of the masquerade introduced a chaotic variable into the carefully maintained equation of royal succession. In a world where the right to rule was transmitted solely through the blood, the paternity of a child was the single most important fact of their existence. Yet, as the nights at St. Pol grew wilder and the partners more interchangeable, the certainty of bloodlines began to dissolve. If a noblewoman spent the night in the arms of a masked lover, and 9 months later produced an heir, who could truly say that the child carried the blood of the father whose name he bore? This fear of the bastard in the cradle was the phantom that haunted the waking hours of every nobleman in France. It was a fear more potent than the plague, for the plague only killed the body, while the bastard killed the dynasty. The presence of an illegitimate child within the line of succession was a ticking time bomb, a potential cause for civil war, disputed inheritances, and the collapse of family honor. The masquerade, by institutionalizing anonymous sex, was effectively weaponizing the womb. It turned the royal nursery into a place of suspicion, where every fair-haired child born to dark-haired parents was scrutinized for signs of the stable boy or the wandering minstrel. Nowhere was this anxiety more acute than around the figure of Queen Isabeau herself. As the king's madness deepened and his ability to rule, and to perform his marital duties, waned, Isabeau became the center of a vortex of rumors. The people of Paris, who hated her for her foreign origins and her lavish spending, whispered that the queen's children were not the king's. They pointed to the frequent masquerades, the balls of the savages, as proof that the queen was breeding a brood of mongrels to sit on the throne of Charlemagne. Every pregnancy was met not with celebration, but with a cynical calculus of conception dates and the queen's known whereabouts during the carnival season. The primary suspect in these whispered scandals was often Louis, Duke of Orleans, the king's own brother. Handsome, virile, and dangerously closely related to the crown, Louis was the undisputed master of the masquerade. He moved through the darkened halls with the confidence of a predator, his mask a permanent fixture of his public persona. It was an open secret that he and the queen shared a bond that went beyond sister-in-law and brother-in-law. In the chaotic anonymity of the ball, they could dance in plain sight, their intimacy dismissed as part of the game, while in reality, they were potentially rewriting the genetic future of the Valois dynasty. This intertwining of sex and politics created a toxic atmosphere where no one could be trusted. The gallant games were not merely about pleasure, they were about power. Knowledge of who was sleeping with whom became a currency more valuable than gold coinage. Spies disguised as servants or fellow revelers circulated through the parties, trying to peek behind the masks, to catch a glimpse of a ring or a scar that would betray an identity. Blackmail became a standard tool of court diplomacy. A noble caught in a compromising position with the wrong woman could be manipulated, his vote in the council swayed, his loyalty purchased with silence. Yet, despite the dangers, the court could not stop. The addiction to the masquerade was too strong. It was as if the entire nobility of France was engaged in a collective death drive, a desire to obliterate themselves in the pursuit of sensation. The church thundered against these abominations, calling them the synagogues of Satan, warning that the devil himself walked among the dancers, hiding his horns under a velvet hood. Preachers predicted that fire would rain from heaven to cleanse the sodomites and adulterers, just as it had destroyed Gomorrah. But the court laughed at these prophecies, secure in their belief that their high birth protected them from divine wrath. The psychological toll of this double life was immense. To live as a pious Christian by day and a faceless hedonist by night required a fracturing of the self that mirrored the king's own shattered mind. The nobles of the court became actors who never stepped off the stage, their true selves withering away beneath layers of performance. The mask became more real than the face beneath it. They began to crave the night not just for the sex, but for the silence of the conscience. In the dark, there was no sin, only sensation. This moral numbness prepared the ground for the tragedy to come, desensitizing them to the danger they were courting. The children born of this era, the children of the carnival, grew up in a court defined by secrets. They were surrounded by uncles who might have been their fathers, and cousins who might have been siblings. This erosion of the nuclear family structure weakened the bonds of loyalty that held the feudal system together. If a man could not be sure his son was his own, why should he fight to build a legacy for him? If a brother suspected his brother of sleeping with his wife, how could they stand shield to shield in battle? The masquerade was slowly dissolving the glue of medieval society, turning the aristocracy into a collection of isolated, paranoid individuals. As the fateful year of 1393 approached, the intensity of these gatherings increased. The winter was harsh, the rivers froze, and the wolves crept closer to the city walls, but inside the Hotel St. Pol, the heat rose. The court demanded ever more shocking diversions, ever more elaborate disguises. The line between human and animal, between noble and savage, was being tested nightly. It was in this climate of escalating extremity that the idea for the dance of the wild men was born. It was the logical conclusion of decades of dehumanization. If they had been acting like beasts in private for so long, why not finally dress the part? The irony was that the anonymity they prized so highly would become the very instrument of their destruction. In a normal gathering, if a man caught fire, his friends would recognize him and rush to aid him by name. But in the masquerade, a burning figure was just another spectacle, another anonymous horror to be watched with a mix of fascination and detachment. The culture of the mask had trained the courtiers to observe without interfering, to treat everything as a performance. When the flames would finally rise, this learned passivity, this inability to connect the suffering figure with a human identity, would cost lives. Thus, the stage was set not by a single bad decision, but by a generation of moral decay. The gallant games had stripped the court of its empathy and its caution. They had created a world where identity was fluid, where consequences were suspended, and where the fire of passion was the only light they trusted. But fire is a capricious master. The flames that had been metaphorically consuming the souls of the French nobility for years were about to manifest in the physical world, fed by pitch, flax, and the terrible arrogance of those who believed they could dance with the devil and not get burned. The masquerade was over, the reckoning was about to begin. While the nobility drowned themselves in the sensory overload of the masquerade, a different kind of current was flowing through the narrow, mud-slick streets of Paris, one that was dark, venomous, and impossible to contain. The walls of the Hotel St. Pol were thick stone, designed to withstand sieges and arrows, but they were porous to the most dangerous element of all, the truth, or at least the twisted version of it that leaked out from the servants' quarters. Every time a scullery maid carried a basket of soiled linens from the palace, or a groom whispered to a tavern keeper about what he had seen in the stables, the stories multiplied, mutating as they traveled from the royal enclave to the bustling markets of Les Halles. The people of Paris, suffering under heavy taxes to pay for these endless festivities, began to weave a narrative that was far more damaging than any military defeat. They spoke of the children of the carnival, a phantom generation of infants born in the shadows of the court, their lineage as murky as the Seine in winter. The rumors were not merely idle gossip, they were a direct assault on the sacred mystique of the monarchy. In the medieval mind, the king was God's anointed, his blood possessing miraculous properties, including the ability to cure scrofula. But if that blood was diluted, mixed with the seed of a jester, a squire, or a rival duke during a drunken masked orgy, the divine mandate was broken. The primary target of this vitriol was Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, a woman who found herself trapped in the impossible position of regent to a mad husband and mother to a dynasty under siege. Because she was a foreigner, her customs were viewed with suspicion, and her love for fashion and dance was interpreted by the pious populace as evidence of a depraved soul. When the queen appeared at a ball wearing a mask, the public did not see a woman seeking respite from the burden of statecraft, they saw a harlot hiding her shame. The mask became a symbol of her alleged duplicity, a physical manifestation of the secrets she was accused of keeping from the king and the country. The metaphor of the wolf mask seized the public imagination with terrifying force, becoming a staple of the satirical verses sung by drunken students in the Latin Quarter. If the queen danced with a partner whose face was hidden by the visage of a predator, and that partner was not the king, then the sanctity of the royal bedchamber had been violated by a beast. The logic of the mob was brutal and linear. a woman who conceals her face conceals her sins, and a child born from a union of masks is a child without a father. This suspicion cast a long, freezing shadow over the royal nursery, turning every birth into a subject of forensic debate rather than national celebration. This atmosphere of doubt was catastrophic for the concept of legitimacy, which was the glue holding the entire feudal structure together. The French crown relied on the Salic law, which strictly forbade inheritance through the female line, placing an absolute premium on male lineage. But the Masquerade made a mockery of this legal pillar. If a duchess could be impregnated by a man whose name she did not know, amidst a pile of velvet and limbs in a darkened gallery, then the resulting son was a fraud, a cuckoo in the nest who would one day inherit lands and titles that belonged to another. The genetic roulette of the court threatened to turn the aristocracy into a caste of impostors. The Masquerade facilitated this deception by providing the ultimate alibi, plausible deniability. In a court where everyone wore disguises, no one could be definitively placed at the scene of the sin. A husband could not accuse his wife of adultery if he could not prove that the woman in the sheer silk domino was indeed her, and not one of her ladies-in-waiting wearing her jewelry. This confusion was often deliberate, a game played by the women of the court to protect one another. They would swap dresses and masks, creating a shell game of identities that left the men baffled and powerless to enforce their patriarchal authority. Deepening the crisis was the visible fracturing of King Charles VI himself, whose lucid intervals were becoming shorter and more infrequent. During his bouts of madness, he often failed to recognize the Queen, sometimes chasing her from his presence with violence, claiming he did not know who she was. This public rejection fed the rumors that he was not the father of her children. If the king himself pushed the Queen away, the people reasoned, it must be because he sensed the betrayal, possessing a madman's insight into the truth. The tragedy of his mental illness was thus weaponized against the legitimacy of his heirs, specifically the Dauphin, the future Charles VII. The boy who would eventually be known as the Victorious spent his childhood shadowed by the label, the so-called Dauphin. His paternity was the subject of open debate, fueled by the powerful Burgundian faction which sought to undermine the Queen and her ally, the Duke of Orleans. The Burgundian propaganda machine churned out salacious stories, claiming that the Dauphin was the son of Orleans, conceived during one of the infamous masked balls where the king was absent. This was not just a personal insult, it was a political maneuver designed to disinherit the boy and pave the way for a change in dynasty or a puppet government under Burgundian control. The Duke of Orleans, Louis, played the role of the antagonist in this drama with a reckless disregard for the consequences. He was the master of the revels, the man who organized the most extravagant and licentious entertainments. His reputation as a seducer was legendary, and he did little to dispel the rumors that he was the father of half the court's newborns. By treating the paternity of the royal children as a triviality, he inadvertently handed his enemies the dagger they would use to stab the heart of the Valois monarchy. His arrogance blinded him to the fact that by delegitimizing his nephew, he was destroying the very throne he sought to protect or perhaps usurp. Inside the palace, the genetic roulette created a domestic environment of unbearable tension, a veritable pit of vipers where a smile could hide a suspicion and a gift could mask a probe for truth. Husbands looked at their wives with cold calculation, wondering if the child swelling their belly was the result of duty or the memory of a masked stranger's touch. This paranoia seeped into the political alliances. A nobleman might hesitate to pledge loyalty to a duke if he suspected the duke was actually his half-brother, or worse, if he suspected the duke's heir was of common blood. The Masquerade had dissolved the bonds of trust that were essential for the survival of the state. The physical reality of these illicit pregnancies was managed through a conspiracy of silence involving midwives, wet nurses, and loyal servants. The heavy, voluminous fashions of the late 14th century, with their high waistlines and gathered fabrics, were perfectly suited for concealing the early and middle stages of pregnancy. A noblewoman could carry a carnival child, almost to term without the court being the wiser, attributing her changing figure to the indulgence of the banquets. When the time came, a sudden illness would require a retreat to a country estate, where the child would be born and quietly placed with a foster family, growing up as a squire or a page, never knowing their true blood. However, not all these children were hidden away, some were brazenly passed off as legitimate, leading to a generation of nobility where the physical resemblance between father and son was often laughably absent. The courtiers, trained in the art of flattery, would praise the likeness of a dark-eyed child to his blue-eyed father, while privately exchanging knowing glances. This collective hypocrisy corroded the moral fiber of the court. It taught the young that truth was flexible, that honor was a performance, and that the only sin was getting caught without a mask. The child of the carnival became a cynical archetype, a symbol of the era's rot. The church, watching this degradation from the pulpit, thundered that the biological chaos was a manifestation of spiritual disorder. Preachers declared that a kingdom where the seed was mixed in the dark would reap a harvest of blood in the light. They drew parallels to the biblical curses, warning that God would not suffer a bastard to sit on the throne of St. Louis. These sermons resonated deeply with the superstitious populace, who began to see every misfortune, every crop failure, every flood, every outbreak of flux, as divine punishment for the sexual anarchy of the court. The masquerade was no longer just a party, it was a plague upon the land. As the years ground on, the distinction between the legitimate and the illegitimate became so blurred that it ceased to matter to the cynics, but it mattered intensely to the lawyers and the diplomats. The English, eyeing the French throne across the Channel, watched these developments with glee. They saw the cracks in the Valois succession not as a tragedy, but as a legal loophole. If the Dauphin was a bastard born of a masquerade, then the English king, with his solid lineage, had a better claim to France. The gallant games were thus laying the groundwork for the next disastrous phase of the 100 Years' War, providing the enemy with the ammunition of moral superiority. The Queen, isolated in her luxury, tried to counter these rumors with even more lavish displays of splendor, as if she could dazzle the accusations out of existence with gold leaf and pearls. But every ball she threw, every mask she donned, only confirmed the prejudices against her. She became the villain in her own story, trapped in a cycle where the only way to cope with the stress of the rumors was to seek the oblivion of the party, which in turn generated more rumors. It was a tragic spiral, a dance of death where the music never stopped, even as the floor began to crumble beneath the dancers' feet. By the winter of 1393, the tension regarding the legitimacy of the royal line had reached a breaking point. The court was not just a collection of hedonists, it was a powder keg of anxieties waiting for a spark. The upcoming Dance of the Savages was not merely a prank, it was a desperate attempt to reclaim a sense of masculine power and control in a world where paternity had become meaningless. By dressing as wild men, the king and his favorites were perhaps unconsciously trying to tap into a primal, indisputable force of nature, fleeing the complex, suffocating web of lies and genealogy they had spun around themselves. Ultimately, the tragedy of the children of the carnival was that they were the innocent byproducts of a society that had lost its way. They were the living evidence of an aristocracy that had prioritized pleasure over duty, and anonymity over honor. As the court prepared for that fateful night in January, the ghosts of these hidden children stood unseen in the corners of the ballroom, a silent chorus witnessing the impending doom. The fire that was about to consume the dancers would be interpreted by many as a purging flame, a violent attempt by Providence to burn away the masks and force the court to finally, terrifyingly, show its true face. The night of the 28th of January, in the year of our Lord 1393, arrived not with a whisper, but with the biting cold of a Parisian winter that froze the breath in one's throat. Outside the heavy stone walls of the Hotel St. Paul, the city lay huddled in darkness, the streets empty save for the bravest watchmen and the starving dogs that scavenged for bones in the frozen gutters. But inside the royal residence, the atmosphere was a blistering counterpoint to the chill, a fever dream of warmth, light, and manic energy that had been building for weeks. The occasion was the wedding feast of Catherine de Fastavarina, a beloved lady-in-waiting to the Queen, and the court had seized upon this pretext to stage a celebration that would eclipse all previous excesses. This particular night was destined to be the crescendo of Queen Isabeau's reign of festivities, a moment when the boundaries between the civilized court and the untamed wilderness were deliberately dissolved. The air in the great hall was heavy, almost unbreathable, thick with the smoke of roasting meats, the cloying scent of spiced wine, and the sweat of hundreds of bodies moving in the confined space. Musicians played with a frantic intensity, their rhythms driving the dancers into a frenzy that bordered on hysteria. It was a setting primed for a spectacle, a stage awaiting actors who were willing to shed their humanity for the amusement of a bored and decadent audience. Deep within the bowels of the palace, in a secluded chamber known only to a few trusted confederates, the King of France and 5 of his highest-ranking nobles were undergoing a transformation that was as physical as it was psychological. They were preparing to become the woodwasses, the mythical wild men of the forest who haunted the medieval imagination. This was not merely a matter of donning a mask, it was a ritual of erasure. The men were stripped of their silks and velvets, the trappings of their high station, and sewn into tight-fitting linen garments that covered them from neck to toe, adhering to their skin like a second dermis. Once encased in these linen sheaths, the true horror of the costume's construction began. Servants, working with the efficiency of embalmers, smeared the fabric with a thick, viscous layer of pitch and resin. This substance, usually employed to waterproof the hulls of ships or seal the roofs of castles, was highly flammable, a fact that was dangerously overlooked in the pursuit of aesthetic realism. While the pitch was still tacky, handfuls of unraveled flax and tow were pressed into the adhesive, creating a shaggy, matted coat of fur that bristled with every movement. The smell in the room was overpowering, a toxic mix of pine resin, sweat, and anticipation. When the transformation was complete, the 6 men stood unrecognizable, their human forms bulked out and distorted by the layers of padding and faux fur. They were no longer Charles VI, King of France, Hugues de Guise, the Count of Joigny, Yvain de Foix, Ogre de Nantouillet, or the young Poitiers. They were beasts, anonymous monsters of the woods, identical in their savagery. To complete the illusion, and to ensure that they stayed together, they were shackled one to another with a heavy iron chain. This chain was the masterstroke of the performance, symbolizing their captive nature, but it also bound their fates together in the most literal and terrifying way possible. Before they left the preparation chamber, a strict order had been issued by the king's advisors, who retained a sliver of prudence amidst the madness. Seeing the volatile nature of the costumes, they commanded that all torches in the ballroom be extinguished or moved to the far walls, away from the dance floor. The only light was to come from the distant hearths and the few sconces high out of reach. It was a safety precaution born of the knowledge that the king and his companions were effectively walking kegs of gunpowder, needing only a single spark to ignite. For a brief moment, sanity tried to assert itself against the chaos. With the lights dimmed to a sepulchral gloom, the great doors of the hall were thrown open, and the 6 savages burst into the room with a cacophony of animalistic howls and the heavy clanking of their chains. The effect was instantaneous and electric. The courtiers, already intoxicated and eager for diversion, shrieked in a mixture of mock terror and genuine delight. The sudden appearance of these shaggy giants, thrashing and pulling against their bonds, tapped into a deep vein of folklore and fear. The Woodwoes was a figure of sexual potency and unbridled violence, and to see 6 of them in the heart of the royal palace was a thrill that transgressed all social norms. The dancers moved into the center of the hall, performing a grotesque parody of a saraband, stomping their feet and gnashing their teeth behind their masks. The anonymity was absolute. Not a soul in the room, save for the conspirators, knew which beast was the king. Charles, hidden beneath layers of glue and flax, felt a surge of liberation that his fragile mind had craved for years. In the suit, he was not the mad monarch, the broken vessel of God, he was a force of nature, fearing nothing, commanding attention not by his title, but by his raw, physical presence. He was indistinguishable from his vassals, a king reduced to, or elevated to, the status of a pure creature. The ladies of the court, emboldened by the masquerade and the dim light, approached the chained dancers, flirting with the danger. They reached out to touch the rough texture of the flax, laughing as the savages lunged at them. It was a game of high-stakes sexual tension, an enactment of the beauty and the beast archetype. The Duchess of Berry, the king's young aunt, found herself intrigued by one particular savage who seemed less aggressive than the others. She caught him by the arm, pulling him slightly away from the group as far as the chain would allow, and playfully demanded to know his identity, draping the heavy fabric of her skirt over him to shield him from the others in a gesture of mock capture. This innocent act by the Duchess would prove to be the difference between life and death for the monarch. By pulling the king aside, she unwittingly separated him by a few crucial feet from the main cluster of the chained dancers. The other 5 remained in a tight knot in the center of the floor, continuing their wild gyrations, taunting the crowd, and reveling in the confusion they had sown. The hall was filled with laughter, music, and the rustle of silk, a symphony of hedonism that masked the approach of doom. The court was lost in the fantasy, blind to the fact that they were dancing on the edge of an abyss. It was at this precise moment of peak revelry that the doors opened once more, admitting a late arrival who would act as the agent of destruction. Louis, the Duke of Orleans, accompanied by his uncle the Duke of Berry, stumbled into the hall. They had been dining elsewhere and were undeniably drunk, their judgment clouded by wine and arrogance. Louis, the king's brother and the notorious lover of the queen, was a man who chafed at secrets he did not own. Seeing the commotion in the center of the room and the darkened state of the hall, he felt a surge of irritation and curiosity. He wanted to know who dared to capture the court's attention so completely. Ignoring the explicit prohibition against open flames, the Duke of Orleans called for his servants to bring torches. When they hesitated, or perhaps simply moving too slowly for his impatience, he grabbed a torch from a bearer, the flames licking hungrily at the pitch-soaked air. With the unsteady gait of the intoxicated, he marched towards the center of the room, his eyes fixed on the 5 chained figures who were still dancing wildly. To Lewis, this was just another game, another riddle to be solved by his wit and his will. He did not see the danger, he saw only a challenge to his omniscience. The Duke approached the dancers, holding the torch aloft like a weapon of interrogation. "Who are you?" he might have shouted, his voice slurring, but the words were lost in the music. He needed to see the faces behind the masks, to strip away the anonymity that the masquerade protected. He leaned in closer, the open flame dancing dangerously near the highly combustible flax. In his drunken haze, he perhaps wanted to verify if one of them was the king, or perhaps he simply wanted to scare them, to assert his dominance over these savages who mocked the nobility of the court. The physics of the tragedy were merciless and swift. As the Duke leaned forward, peering into the eyeholes of one of the dancers, believed to be the Count of Joigny, a drop of burning wax fell, or perhaps the flame itself brushed against a stray strand of tow. The reaction was not a slow ignition, it was a detonation. The resin and pitch, heated by the dancer's body heat and primed by the dry flax, caught fire with a violent whoosh that sucked the air out of the immediate vicinity. In the blink of an eye, that savage was no longer a man in a costume, he was a pillar of roaring fire. The horror was compounded by the chain. Because the 5 men were shackled together, they could not scatter. As the first man burst into flames, he instinctively recoiled, pulling his companions towards him, into the heart of the inferno. The fire leaped from one pitch-soaked victim to the next with terrifying speed, traveling along the line of the chain like a fuse. Within seconds, the center of the ballroom was transformed from a stage of delight into a bonfire of human flesh. The music faltered and died, replaced by a sound that would haunt the survivors forever, the collective scream of men burning alive inside their own skins. The Duke of Orleans stood frozen, the torch still in his hand, his drunken mind struggling to comprehend the catastrophe he had unleashed. The flames rose high towards the timbered ceiling, casting long, erratic shadows against the walls. The apotheosis of anonymity had reached its grim conclusion. As the men burned, their identities were stripped away not by masks, but by the fire itself, rendering them indistinguishable masses of agony. The king, held safe under the skirts of the Duchess of Berry just a few yards away, watched in paralyzed horror as his friends, his favorites, and his sanity were consumed by the flames of his brother's curiosity. The masquerade was over, the hell had begun. The ignition was not a gradual spread of flame, but a sudden, violent eruption that defied the natural laws of a ballroom. In a fraction of a second, the resin-soaked linen that encased the dancers transformed from a costume into a voracious, chemical beast. The pitch, heated by the bodies of the men and the ambient warmth of the hall, did not merely burn on the surface, it liquefied and boiled, fusing the burning fabric directly to the skin beneath. The woodwasses, who moments before had been play-acting at savagery, were instantly plunged into a reality of torment that no human mind could comprehend. The flax, intended to mimic fur, acted as a wick, drawing the fire around their bodies in a complete, suffocating shroud of orange and blue light that roared louder than the orchestra. The horror was amplified by the cruel mechanics of the chain that bound the 5 dancers together. As the first man, the Count of Joigny, became a pillar of fire, his instinctual reaction was to recoil, to pull away from the source of the heat. But the iron links held fast, dragging his companions into the inferno with him. They were yanked off their feet, tumbling into a heap of writhing limbs and melting tar, a collective organism of agony that thrashed upon the floor. The fire leaped from one victim to the next with terrifying speed, finding fresh fuel in the dry tow and the sticky pitch, turning the center of the hall into a bonfire fueled by the flower of French nobility. Amidst this swirling vortex of death, a single act of quick thinking altered the course of history. The young Duchess of Berry, who had been holding the king's arm when the spark was struck, did not flee in panic like the others. Recognizing the lethal danger, she threw her heavy, voluminous skirts over the king, tackling him to the ground and covering him completely. The velvet and gold brocade of her dress, thick and heavy, acted as a fire blanket, smothering the sparks before they could ignite the king's own resin-coated suit. Underneath that dark, suffocating tent of fabric, Charles VI lay trembling, listening to the screams of his friends dying inches away, the heat of their immolation radiating through the floorboards against his cheek. For the other 4 men, there was no such salvation. The scene in the hall descended into absolute bedlam as the courtiers, realizing that this was not a performance, stampeded toward the doors. The air filled with the acrid, unmistakable stench of burning hair and roasting flesh, a smell that would impregnate the tapestries and the memories of those present for decades. One of the dancers, the young Yvain de Foy, screamed for water, his voice cracking as the flames inhaled the oxygen from his lungs, but in the confusion, no one could reach him. The servants stood paralyzed, holding their ewers of wine, unable to comprehend that the monsters burning before them were the sons of the greatest houses in France. Only one other dancer managed to escape the ultimate fate, through a feat of desperate strength born of adrenaline. Ogre de Nantouillet, seeing his companions consumed, managed to snap the chain or slip his shackles in the frenzy. With his costume already blazing, he sprinted across the hall, a human comet trailing smoke, and threw himself into a large vat of water and wine used to rinse the drinking goblets. The liquid hissed and steamed as he submerged himself, extinguishing the flames but leaving him horrifically scalded, a broken man who would bear the scars of that night as a living map of the court's folly. For the remaining three, the Count of Joigny, Amory de Poitiers, and Huguet de Gissé, the end was prolonged and excruciating. The pitch did not burn itself out quickly, it clung to them, burning slow and hot, melting through muscle and sinew. They remained alive for an agonizingly long time, their screams echoing off the vaulted ceiling, pleading for death or mercy, neither of which came swiftly. The courtiers, trapped in the hall by the crush at the doors, were forced to witness the grisly spectacle of their friends being reduced to charred husks, the fire stripping away not just their costumes, but their humanity, leaving behind unrecognizable effigies of blackened bone. The Duke of Orleans, the architect of the disaster, stood watching the conflagration with the torch still hanging from his hand, his drunkenness evaporated by the shock. He had sought to illuminate the truth behind the masks, to expose the identities of the dancers, but he had succeeded only in erasing them completely. The guilt that descended upon him in that moment was crushing. He had effectively murdered his peers and nearly killed his brother and sovereign. The political ramifications were immediate and devastating, but in that moment, it was the personal horror that dominated, the realization that his arrogance had turned a night of pleasure into a massacre. When the flames finally died down and the smoke began to clear, the Hotel St. Pol resembled a battlefield rather than a palace. The blackened remains of the dancers lay on the scorched floor, still smoking, while the survivors wept in corners, their finery stained with soot and the splatter of the tragedy. The king, emerging from beneath the duchess's skirts, was physically unharmed but psychologically shattered. He stared at the bodies of the men he had laughed with only moments ago, unable to reconcile the charred lumps with the vibrant youths they had been. The shock triggered a relapse into his illness that was deeper and more permanent than any before. The news of the Bal d'Ardents, or the Ball of the Burning Men, burst out of the palace gates at dawn, spreading through the streets of Paris like the plague itself. The reaction of the populace was not one of sympathy, but of righteous fury and vindication. For years, the people had watched the court's excesses with growing resentment, hearing the rumors of the masked orgies and the wasted taxes. Now, they saw the fire as a direct intervention from the Almighty, a biblical judgment upon a nest of vipers. The mob gathered outside the royal residence, shouting curses at the sorcerers and sodomites who had brought this wrath upon the kingdom. To appease the anger of the city and perhaps to assuage their own terrified consciences, the court was forced to perform a humiliating public penance. The king's uncles and the Duke of Orleans, stripped of their jewels and finery, walked barefoot through the mud of Paris to the Cathedral of Notre Dame, carrying candles and heads bowed in shame. It was a stark visual contrast to the masquerades they held so dear. Instead of masks to hide their identities, they were exposed to the jeers of the commoners. Instead of silk, they wore the rough penitential garb of sinners. The fire had burned away the barrier between the court and the people, revealing the rot at the heart of the state. However, the most catastrophic legacy of the fire was not the death of the dancers, but the final destruction of King Charles VI's mind. The trauma of the fire cauterized his insanity, locking him into a cycle of delusion from which he would never fully emerge. He forgot his name, his rank, and most damagingly, his family. He recoiled from Queen Isabeau in terror, claiming he did not know that woman and demanding she be removed from his sight. This public rejection was the final nail in the coffin of the dynasty's legitimacy. If the king himself denied his wife, then he implicitly denied the children she bore. The doubts that had been whispering in the shadows during the years of the masquerades now roared in the open. The children of the carnival, born in the atmosphere of anonymous sex and shifting identities, were now viewed as confirmed bastards. The Dauphin, the future Charles VII, was branded with the stigma of illegitimacy, a child of the Queen's debauchery rather than the King's blood. The logic was cold and inescapable: the King was mad, the Queen was a known adulteress, and the court was a pit of vice where lineage was a joke. Therefore, the Valois line was broken, its divine right extinguished by the flames of the ball. This vacuum of legitimacy created an opening that the enemies of France were all too eager to exploit. The Duchy of Burgundy, seeing the weakness of the crown, launched a vicious propaganda campaign, openly accusing the Queen of treason and incest with the Duke of Orleans. They painted the court as a brothel run by a Bavarian whore, a narrative that resonated deeply with a population tired of war and taxes. The civil war that followed was not just a struggle for land, but a moral crusade against a dynasty that had lost its right to rule. The fire at the ball had burned away the mystique of the monarchy, leaving it vulnerable to the wolves. Across the English Channel, the House of Lancaster watched the disintegration of their rival with predatory patience. The question of the Dauphin's paternity became the legal pretext for the renewal of the 100 Years' War. When Henry V eventually invaded, he did not come merely as a conqueror, but as a claimant with a moral argument. Why should the French throne belong to a so-called Dauphin of dubious birth, born of a mother who danced with wolves, when it could belong to a pious, legitimate English king? The Bal d'Ardens had provided the legal and moral ammunition for the English longbows. The culmination of this tragedy was the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, a document that effectively signed the death warrant of the independent French kingdom. In this treaty, Queen Isabeau herself, broken, manipulated, and perhaps believing the lies about her own son, agreed to disinherit the Dauphin Charles. She declared him illegitimate, confirming the darkest rumors of the Carnival years, and named Henry V of England as the heir to the French throne. It was the ultimate betrayal, the final act of the masquerade, the Queen unmasking her own son as a bastard to save her own skin and position. Thus, the fire that was sparked by a drunken torch in a Paris ballroom did not stop burning when the bodies were cleared away. It smoldered for decades, consuming the fabric of the nation. It burned through the legitimacy of the laws, the loyalty of the subjects, and the inheritance of the crown. The era of the gallant games, with its thrill of anonymity and its flirtation with the forbidden, had ended in the total collapse of the state. The masks that had been worn to hide the sins of the flesh had ultimately served to hide the destruction of the kingdom, proving that while one can hide one's face from the court, one cannot hide one's fate from history. In the end, the Bal d'Ardens stands as a grim monument to the dangers of absolute power combined with absolute irresponsibility. It was a moment when the pursuit of pleasure overrode the instinct for survival, when the rulers of a nation forgot that they were not merely actors on a stage, but guardians of a legacy. The screams of the burning dancers were the death knell of the medieval age in France, ushering in a century of blood and iron. The masquerade was over, the lights were extinguished, and France was left in the dark, ruled by a mad king who saw enemies in the shadows and strangers in his own children. The legacy of that night is a terrifying reminder that the seeds of national collapse are often sown not on the battlefield, but in the boudoir. The anonymity that the courtiers prized so highly became their curse. By trying to be everyone and no one, they became nothing. The illegitimate princes, the children of the Carnival, were left to fight for a throne that had been turned to ash, while the English marched on Paris, convinced that God was on their side. The fire of 1393 had revealed the ultimate truth, that a crown worn by a fool is as flammable as a coat of pitch, and that a dynasty built on secrets is destined to burn.